So I played every Street Fighter game ever, from the first right up to the recently released Street Fighter 6, kicking off with the original Street Fighter. Now, for a game released way back in 1987, this game looks and sounds surprisingly good. I mean, there's unique stages, sound effects and abilities for each fight, and they all match the style of the character you're fighting too, which for a game this old is pretty amazing. Not to mention the minigames between every few rounds, alongside a somewhat generous moveset. Sure, there's no combos, supers or really anything outside of the basics, but it makes for a much slower and more tactical gameplay, which I actually really liked. At least for the first two fights, because after that, the game completely flips. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say this game is by far the hardest Street Fighter game ever. In fact, it might just be the hardest fighting game I've ever played against an AI, who cheats so constantly and in such disgusting ways I have no idea how or even if it's possible to beat this game, without either using save states or just spamming specials, which Capcom kindly made truly special here. Even with practice, I can barely hit them 5% of the time I want to. The frame window is incredibly harsh and makes the more tactical gameplay completely useless as the fights progress, unless you can hit the timing window on the specials. And don't expect to just be able to switch to another character with more forgiving ones. There's only two here and they both play the exact same. Beyond that, there isn't a whole lot here, but given how everybody basically forgot this game existed, I was expecting something much worse. Really, the original Street Fighter game is decent. I had fun trying to get some wins, and I'm surprised it isn't talked about more. I guess it just shows how much better the sequel was. Street Fighter 2 is bigger, bolder and better in basically every way. There's new graphics, animations, storylines and well, everything really. But the biggest stars are easily the now iconic but then new characters, each with their own movesets, crisp animations and specials, which are thankfully easier to hit though lacking the punch of the previous title. This lets you experiment a lot more than before and find someone who plays in a way you might like. Maybe by being super aggressive and moving fast like Chun-Li, or by doing nothing at all in an entire fight and then getting one grab and instantly winning like Zhang. All of this is helped a lot by the combo system, which I found out that Capcom introduced for the first time in a fighting game here in Street Fighter 2. It's not perfectly fluid and can at times feel a little clunky, but it makes the fights a lot more fun than before, if again only for the first few fights, because just like before, Capcom made it so unless you're superhuman, you're probably not beating this game against the AI. Still, I can see why so many people view this as the real starting point of the franchise, with all of the series' hallmarks here just needing some more time and attention, which it certainly got. See, Street Fighter 2 is also the first Capcom game to get a series of updates, starting with the Champion Edition that didn't really add much, but it did make the boss characters playable, which is pretty cool, though I will say I only really cared for Bison despite playing the game multiple times. Turbo versions of the game were up next, which sped the game up and introduced some new combos, but I'm honestly not a huge fan of the speed increase. This was probably crazy fun when playing in an arcade with other people, but against Street Fighter 2's AI, it just means the windows for punishment get even smaller, as did the time I had to react to them. Thankfully, the new challenges update didn't include the turbo speed increase. It did add some better graphics, audio and more characters, including some now fan favourites, but otherwise didn't really change up the base game too much. Capcom rounded out Street Fighter 2 with Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which as you can tell increased the speed but also introduced super combos, which I could barely use thanks to the AI and I feel like were more prototypes here than an actual feature. Up next is not Street Fighter 3 but the Alpha games, which were designed to act as a story bridge between the first and second ones. Now, I never saw these games get talked about anywhere, so I didn't exactly have high hopes. But honestly, they are pretty good, especially after Alpha 1. See, where before I said that Street Fighter 2's combo system was somewhat clunky, the Alpha games are much smoother, thanks to improvements to the combo system and blocking. And while it wasn't the first Street Fighter game to add super combos, it does feel like they were designed for these games, because they feel a lot smoother to use. All of this, plus the better graphics and decently challenging but not totally broken AI, makes for some honestly super fun games. It's the first classic Street Fighter game I played that feels the closest to the modern ones. That said, Alpha 1 is kind of rough around the edges. I get the feeling Capcom rushed this title out, as there isn't the usual care and attention to the stage designs, with quite a few of them being just color swapped versions of each other. It also feels a little slower than usual, but maybe that's just me. Alpha 2 on the other hand is basically just Alpha 1 but better. Everything from the characters to pacing, rival battles, custom combo system and stages are just better. And the fact that the game came out less than a year after Alpha 1 and is this much better does make me wonder why Capcom bothered with the original Alpha in the first place. Now you might think that Alpha 3 is then a better Alpha 2, and I guess to some it might be, but to me it's a really weird game. Capcom changed up a lot here, from the engine to movesets, and added an ism system that lets you change up the character specials, mechanics, yada yada. But honestly it's more complexity that I don't feel like the game really needed. I can see the appeal it must have had to others, but for me though, Alpha 2 is just the better game. Street Fighter 3 is without a doubt the most beautifully animated fighting game ever. It looks and feels incredible, and the attention to detail Capcom put in can be seen everywhere. Most stages now have transitions between rounds, like falling bridges or indoor-outdoor swap-ups. Heck, they even added multiple new stun sprites, including a new turned around one. Like, I don't know what more to say. It's like a liquid painting. If that's even a thing, I guess this would be it. Mechanically speaking, the game is as fluid as possible, with quick dashes and improvements to the super system now called Super Arts from the already great Alpha games. It's just amazing. There's just one problem. I don't understand why Capcom did all of this and then added the most paper-thin forgettable roster to date. It doesn't include basically any of the iconic characters from the previous games, instead opting for a tiny cast of mostly forgettable no-namers. Now they ain't all bad. Dudley and Necro are cool, but compared to previous characters there's no competition. And as much as I hate them, the loss of all the grapplers is bad for the game as a whole. And that really was and is the biggest problem with Street Fighter 3. Something you think Capcom would address quickly in the first major update, but instead they went and added, well, some more no-namers, with the focus being instead on the new specials using a portion of the Super Art bar, which is nice, though the animations and stages are the real stars of the update. It would be the third and final update for Street Fighter 3, Third Strike, that finally added the old iconic characters, but for some reason this came at the cost of some of the animations and set pieces from the previous versions, like stage transitions which are pretty much all removed, which to me is a huge loss, and while mechanically the final old generation game is the best, I can't say I like it more than the previous ones. 11 years later, Street Fighter was back, with 2.5D characters, dynamic animations and a whole new combo set. Street Fighter 4 basically brought everything you'd expect and everything a fighting game needed to finally arrive to the home console era. Mechanically it's still the same as the regular Street Fighter games, but Capcom have made some pretty clever changes to make the game easier than ever to get into, with a proper training mode, new guard break moves, and the addition of a counter super that makes comebacks easier than ever before. Do they lower the skill ceiling? Yeah, a little bit, but they are really fun to use, so I don't really mind. That aside, I will say that the frame window on some of the special moves feels off. It's incredibly tight compared to the previous games, but when you do get the stuff out it feels great. And thankfully this time Capcom did bring back fan favourite characters, as well as a much more balanced AI, making the single player mode a lot more fun compared to previous games. Now in classic Capcom fashion, Street Fighter 4 got some updates, but compared to old generation games, these were much more minor, adding new characters, stages and tweaks, but not really mixing up the base gameplay at all. Really though, Street Fighter 4's impact isn't in the gameplay today, it's in the history of the game's release. This was the fighting game that put the genre back on the map after the arcades were wiped out, and established the game and the series as a whole as the king of fighters. Ask any fighting game fan about this game, and even if they don't like it or think some parts of it were cheap, they probably won't deny just how important this game was. Which makes Street Fighter V's failure even more shocking. Mechanically it's mostly the same Street Fighter game as before, but Capcom made some decisions that even today I just can't understand. Counter supers were removed, which does make sense, but they replaced them with the trigger system. Now in theory this is a great system. It buffs up the character and adds new moves and abilities, but in practice it's like playing half a character that's gated behind the trigger. The game also feels slower than Street Fighter 4, which isn't helped by the lack of personality in the stage design compared to previous games, or the paper-thin roster that the game launched with. Sure, today with all the DLC and updates it's good, but really Street Fighter V didn't push the boundary much compared to 4, and to me, and honestly a lot of others, it's the weakest game in the series, and it's the one I enjoyed playing the least. Now none of this really justifies calling this game a failure, but if you're familiar with this game's history you know why I said that and what's coming next. Now I'm not going to talk too much about the launch date, since that's been beaten into the ground by now. What I will say is that Street Fighter V's biggest impact is that its awful launch paved the way for other fighting games to come through, with really any game not called Street Fighter getting a chance to steal some of the series' limelight. And they didn't waste it, with Tekken probably being the game to benefit most, and in a way I'm kind of glad that happened. I think it helped the genre as a whole, and we got some amazing storylines from them. Street Fighter VI is the biggest, boldest and best entry in the series to date, with a great launch roster, beautiful stages, great art design and the most interesting combat system to date that mixes a lot of the previous game systems together. But that's Street Fighter, right? You'd expect all of this. It's really two new features that the game has that makes this entry the one with the potential to be the most important fighting game ever: modern controls and world tour. One of the biggest issues with fighting games is that they're friggin' hard, with executing even simple combos taking hours of practice for a single character, and even then, in the pressure of a match you'll fumble them and other things constantly, as you can probably tell from my gameplay. This mixed with an experienced player base means getting in and sticking around is hard. Enter modern controls, a revamped system that lets less experienced players do a lot of the cool stuff that would take forever to learn otherwise. Now different control schemes in fighting games isn't something new, but they tend to be clunky, annoying or just so gimped that they aren't fun to use, and don't even mention auto controls. But modern controls are different, and the best way to show it is to just see the community reaction so far, where new players have been able to reach plat ranks and higher thanks to these controls. Really the only criticism they get is that they might be too strong. Yeah, I also think that modern grapplers could use a nerf, but if that's the only problem with them, then this is a fantastic win for Capcom and fighting game fans as a whole. I wouldn't be surprised to see similar schemes come in other games. Sure, purists will and are complaining it's dumbing down the game, but I see it more as raising the floor, but I guess only time will tell. Now while modern controls are great, it's actually World Tour that I think is the biggest feature here. See, there will always be a large casual fanbase who will never touch 1v1 modes. Even if you gave them a 99% insta win button, they just won't. Playing 1 vs 1 against other players is just not for them. And so for the past forever, this casual player base never got to play Street Fighter or really any of the other mainline fighters. Because let's be honest, while these games have single player content, you wouldn't buy the games for it. But World Tour changes that, mixing a bit of the Yakuza games into an actually legitimate single player mode, complete with a custom avatar. And it's not a sideshow either. There's a ton of content here with some great writing, animations, designs, customization and progression. It helps flesh out the fighters in a way that the other games and media never have, while slowly training you in the basics and increasing the challenge in fights as you go. Did I mention how smooth it is jumping in between walking around the world and getting into a fight? It might not seem like a big deal, but over time, without it, the game mode would just be way more frustrating. And the fact that Capcom realized this and designed it this way really shows the care they put into this mode. Sure, it's a little janky and a bit light-hearted, and I doubt veteran players care. But the potential is all here, and for a first outing in the genre it's incredible, and means that the giant market of people who wanted to jump in but had nothing to play now do. We could even see single player DLC one day, which would have been a bigger joke than horse armor in any other entry. Now all of this mixed with the fantastic base content that Street Fighter VI has, and it's no surprise that this game is breaking records. It's a good time to be a Street Fighter fan, and with the new Tekken and Mortal Kombat games on the horizon, it's never been a better time to be a fighting game fan either.